Welcome to my presentation on how to make injectable implants for drug delivery. My name is Valerie Pietsch and I am an application specialist for pharmaceutical and food extrusion processes at Thermo Fisher Scientific located in Karlsruhe, Germany. Now, to start with my presentation, I would like to start, of course, with a brief introduction, and after that, I want to present an overview on the product design of implants and how drug release properties of the implants can be tailored by the implant design. And last but not least, I want to talk about process design for hot melt extrusion and specifically point out critical control points along the process and present solutions on how to handle them. Now let's start with the definition. So in general, implants are considered as drug delivery systems where a polymer is loaded with an API. And typically these implants have a shape of a thin and round extruded or co-extruded, as you can see in the exemplary pictures on the bottom of the slide. And it is also possible, of course, to apply different types of polymers that allow to attain either a biodegradable or a biodurable implant. So if a biodegradable polymer such as PLGA or lipids are applied, the implant can degrade during controlled release and does not need to be removed after treatment. And on the contrary, for biodurable polymers such as EVA, the implants of course need to be removed, but this can also be of an advantage in case of incompatibilities occurring. And usually these biodurable implants also allow longer release profiles as well as the application of flexible polymers with mechanical advantages. And usually, of course, these implants are used for subcutaneous treatments for several medication purposes and is indicated here on the right side of the slide. So just to name a few, they can be used as contraceptives, as eye implants, or for the treatment of chronic diseases. Now, compared to oral dosage forms, implants are considered as beneficial because they allow a site-specific drug delivery and more sustained release. And moreover, they can show better effectiveness of treatment within the desired therapeutic window, which allows to minimize side effects and also to increase patient compliance. Now, as for every other drug, of course, the drug release of an implant is also highly dependent on the product design. And these properties usually involve the drug loading and the design of the implant, then also the geometry of the implant in terms of diameter and length, as well as the drug content, the membrane thickness, and the implant porosity and surface roughness. Now, in terms of drug loading and design, there are generally two different types of implants available. So we have here on the one hand a matrix type implant, which includes a drug dispersed in a polymer. And then there's also a reservoir type implant, which refers to an implant that consists of a membrane with a polymer only and a core material where the drug is dispersed in a polymer. In general, the difference between both types is related to the release rate of the implant and the manufacturing process. So while matrix type implants are easier to manufacture, they typically show a higher initial release rate, a so-called burst effect. And this burst effect can be compensated by the reservoir type implant, which usually shows a zero order release rate and can allow also higher drug loading. However, when it comes to manufacturing, a reservoir type implant is much more complex to manufacture, which I will talk about later briefly. And this is quite easier for a matrix type of implant. Furthermore, of course, beside drug loading and design, the geometry of the implant needs to be chosen, which is usually done depending on the application and the total dosage required. And here the application can range from ophthalmic implants for treatment of diseases, so example here to treat impaired vision to macular edema or dry eye syndrome. And other implants can also be applied in the arm or other parts of the human body as contraceptive or for treatment of cancer. And last but not least, there are also contraceptives already available on the market for treatment to causing temporary infertility of male dogs. So there are different kinds of applications already available. And here, just to point out, depending on the applications, there are different kinds of requirements set to the geometry of the implant in general. Now, besides implant geometry, of course, the drug release also depends on the drug content, which is apparently directly proportional to the drug loading of the implant. And furthermore, in the case of reservoir type implants, the membrane thickness can be crucial parameter to influence the drug release rate. And here it's, of course, apparent that the thicker the membrane is, the more prolonged and lower the release rate per day will be. And last but not least, to mention here an example for implant porosity and surface roughness. Here is, of course, to consider that the rougher the surface, the more higher the diffusion controlled release rate can be. And if you look at the examples here depicted on the slide, of course, it can be expected that the diffusion controlled release profile for the implant with a rough surface, as you can see here on the left side of the slide, would be accelerated compared to the implant with an even surface. Now let's talk about the process design for hot melt extrusion, which is generally considered as a key technology for implant manufacturing because this process has a high compounding capability. It can be used for molecular mixing and formation of solid dispersions, and also allows the design of various implants ranging from matrix type implants, but also including reservoir type implants with different diameters and lengths. So for implant manufacturing in general, we offer two different setups that include our Pharma Mini HME conical twin screw extruder and a takeoff as well as a cutting unit. So on the left side of the slide, you see a picture of our Pharma Mini implant line, which presents a complete manufacturing line with integrated controls. And the setup of this machine is usually designed for continuous manufacturing of injectable implants. And on the right side of the picture, you see our R&D setup with the Pharma Mini as a standalone machine and our CaliCut cutting system, which is used usually for manufacturing of implants with different geometries and from different materials. So it's mainly used, as I said already, for R&D purposes. And it also allows to exchange different cutting tools to deal with different material properties. And in general, of course, these setups basically allow to manufacture matrix type implants. In addition to the setups that I just explained, we also have a co-extrusion die available that can be used to manufacture reservoir type implants. And for this setups, two extruders have to be applied. So one extruder in this example here, the Pharma 11 or co-rotating twin screw extruder to extrude the core material where we use a polymer loaded with an API. And then, of course, also as a second extruder, in this case, the Pharma Mini HME, which will then be used to extrude the membrane material. And with the co-extrusion die, then both melt flows will be combined together, and of course, the implant will be generated, and as a downstream equipment, of course, an implant cutting unit will also be needed, and which will be in this case also our CaliCut cutting system. Now, for all of these different setups, it is important to consider several control points that need to be taken care of during the development stage, and in order to make sure to achieve a reliable and continuously running process. And here the first point involves feeding system, of course, where material preparation and feed rate range are important parameters that can affect the success of the complete process. As a second point, the extrusion process itself, of course, accounts as critical control point where the development equipment process should involve defining the right process conditions and also to check the content uniformity and to make sure that the filament that exits the extruder has a certain quality that then can be used for cutting the implants. And in terms of cutting the implants, of course, last control point here is the implant cutting unit, where the line speed of the system basically will determine if we can meet the targeted implant specifications, together with other control points, which I will address a little bit later. Now, first start with the feeding system. When we want to select the feeding specification, of course, it's first of all necessary to have in mind what feed rate do we at all need. So here to explain as an example, if we want to achieve a targeted production rate of, for example, 100 implants per hour, and consider a typical implant weight between 10 and 20 milligram, we will need to aim at a targeted feed rate of roughly 10 to 20 gram per hour. So this means that our feeding systems need to be selected that are capable to cover such a feed rate range. And here, for this purpose, we have different feeder setups available in our portfolio that can cope with such low feed rates and also allow to deal with different kinds of material properties. So here you see on the left of the slide our force feeder that can be used to feed very low feed rates between 2 to 10 gram per hour. And on the right-hand side, you see our mini twin feeder that starts at roughly 5 gram per hour and can cover a very broad range in feed rates. So typically we recommend to work with a mini twin feeder since it can be operated in gravimetric feeding mode, which is very useful to control the exact feed rate. And the force feeder we rather use in special cases where we deal with very low feed rates that are needed, or if the material is very sticky and difficult to feed in general. So of course, it's not only about the feeding system, it's also about the material that we use for feeding. And here there are different ways, of course, to feed your API and excipient to the extrusion process. So usually here we either prefer to work with a powder blend or a pre-compounded blend, whereas when we use a powder blend, of course, the advantage is that we have a good control of content uniformity via pre-mixing. However, if we have two powders that are very different in particle sizes, this type of pre-blending is usually not well suitable for feeding to the extruder, as there's always the risk of demixing of the two different powders of different particle sizes. If you have different particle sizes, then we usually recommend to pre-compound the blend using twin screw extrusion or twin screw granulation. This also allows to even improve the content uniformity. However, of course, it can have the disadvantage that you have to run an additional processing step, which includes the premixing and the compounding of the material before you can start with the implant manufacturing. In general, what we recommend when it comes to feeding is always to keep in mind that what cannot enter the extruder will not come out of the extruder. So here it is always very important to select your powder ingredients to make sure that they are feedable. So to make sure that once you have finalized your formulation development stage, that you're already ready to run the extrusion process without having troubles feeding your material inside the extruder. Now let's go on to the second control point, the hot melt extrusion process. When it comes to that, we usually work with our Pharma Mini HME, which is a conical co-rotating twin screw extruder. So the co-rotating screws we usually use to make sure that we have a good mixing effect, not too high shear input to make sure that we don't degrade our API. And also the conical effect allows us to have a system that runs with almost no pulsation, which is very important to get a constant strand diameter. Then the next part of the setup, which is quite important, is that we have a cool feed funnel that allows us to cool the feeding zone and to avoid material blockage in this section, which can of course also interfere with the complete process. And in the next stage, we have to select, of course, the diameter of our die plate according to the implant specification, but also material properties. So sometimes we have material that is a bit elastic and can be stretched, and this can be can be accounted for by selecting the correct diameter of the die plate. And last but not least, we also have to choose then the right process parameters, which include the throughput, the screw speed, and the temperature. And of course, here temperature is very important a parameter that depends on the material that you use. So you have to make sure that you choose a temperature that allows you to process your material through the extruders to make sure that the viscosity is not too high. But at the same time, of course, you have to make sure that you don't choose too high temperature, of course, to avoid the degradation of your API. Now let's talk about the third control point along the process, the implant cutting units, which is of course the most important part of the process to make sure to keep in the desired implant specifications. And here it is very important to make sure to maintain a line speed which can be handled by the process setup and to keep in the desired implant specifications. Here within these cutting units, there are several control points along the cutting unit that allow you to keep in specs basically and to maintain a constant quality of your implant. So first of all, here we have the filament guiding system that can also be controlled in temperature. I will show an example for that in the next slide. Then we have the laser gauge system that controls the diameter and can also allow you to control the speed of the puller wheel and the conveyor belt, depending on the diameter that you set for your system. And as I said, then we also have the diameter the puller wheel or conveyor belt that can be used for diameter control via the speed setting in this case, and of course the cutting knife that cuts the implant to a specific length. So to give an example on how the control of these points can influence the outcome of the process. So here you see in the video we're showing an example of an implant that is quite narrow in diameter. So it has a diameter of 0.5 millimeter, and you see that the filament that exits the extruder is actually very brittle and breaks at the puller wheel. To avoid this, it is possible to heat up the guiding plates to make sure that the filament stays soft and then that there is no breakage at the puller wheel, as you can see here. Now, with a higher temperature, it's much easier to avoid the breakage. However, you still see that it's quite difficult to thread the material towards the cutting unit. And this is related to the fact that the line speed that is chosen here is a bit too high. And for this, it's always, of course, important to keep in mind that the land speed is dictated by the velocity of the melt, which is mainly given by the feed rate. And here in this case, you see an example of what happens if we lower the feed rate to make the process easier to handle. And you see quite well that with the lower feed rate, it's much easier to handle the process and to cut small implants as desired. Of course, it's not only about cutting the implant into a certain length and also to maintain a certain diameter, but it's also important to pay attention to the cut quality, which can be influenced by the process conditions. In this case, you see, for example, an implant that was cut after having extruded it at a temperature of 135. And here you see that you get an uneven cut surface, whereas when you increase the temperature, for example, the material is still quite soft, which allows you to keep a very even cut surface, which is also important for in terms of patient compatibility. And with these final remarks, I'm at the end of my presentation. I would like To summarize very briefly, so what we've learned today is that we can use injectable implants for a site-specific safe and controlled release of potent APIs. There is an increased number of marketed products, and of course, the choice of materials and shape is always crucial for drug release. And last but not least, we can use hot melt extrusion as the key technologies to compound raw materials and to manufacture injectable implants. And with this, I'm at the end of my presentation. I would like to thank you for your attention. And in case you have further questions, please feel free to drop us an email or to visit our website at thermofisher.com/drug formulation. Thank you.